the emperor in the echo of a voice. The corridors of the domus Aurea whispered with the sound of silk and suspicion. Somewhere deep inside Rome's golden palace, behind velvet curtains and marble arches, sat a man who had once commanded applause from poets and senators alike. Now he sat alone with his memories, haunted not by ghosts but by an absence, an empty space shaped like a woman. But now she was gone, lost, according to the official accounts, to a miscarriage, not behind drawn curtains or under the shadow of some decadent scandal, but in full view of the imperial court, dressed in veils, garlands, and a bridal tunic. Sporus walked beside Nero like a beautiful wife, eyes downcast, the scent of flowers cloaking the rot of the moment. According to others, she was lost of rage, killed by a violent kick to her pregnant belly during one of his infamous fits. The truth, like so much in imperial Rome, was buried in fear and rumor. Rome had seen weddings born of politics, of money, of blood, but never of resurrection. Her name had been Pompeia Sabina. She had been everything Nero desired, ambitious, graceful, venomous when needed, and utterly enchanting in his eyes. Whispers ran like fire through the marble corridors and mosaic courtyards. The emperor had married a boy, not in secret. Witnesses described it as a traditional Roman ceremony. There was a dowry. There were prayers. There were offerings to the household gods. But this was not a wedding. It was a performance. And forced to sleep beside the man who had destroyed both of them in different ways, Nero didn't just want to remember Pompeia. He wanted to possess her again, to control her silence, to rewrite her death. A delusion made flesh. He paraded him through marketplaces and festivals, always beside him, always dressed in silks too heavy for his slight frame. And through it all, Sporus remained silent. Sporus was now not figuratively, but literally addressed by her name, adorned in her jewels. The court played along, as they always did. We only know what he endured as Nero tried to conquer death, not with prayer, but with perversion. And in the darkest corners of Rome, where rumor bloomed like mildew, they began to wonder. Because what could they say? Nero was the emperor. Nero was a god, and gods could not be wrong. But behind the forced smiles and the applause, there was fear. The fear of what it meant when a man like Nero had no limits. Not legal, not moral, not even natural. Castration wasn't new in Rome. Eunuchs had long served in households and temples. But to castrate a child in the name of grief, to erase a boy's identity, to rebuild a broken illusion, statues could not smile, paintings could not breathe. And for a man who had been told all his life that he was divine, the permanence of death was unbearable, something that blurred the line between mourning and madness. Nero took Sporus on public appearances. He called him Empress, perhaps because of fear. Some said Sporus bore an uncanny resemblance to Pompeia, as if her soul had been reborn in male flesh. Others believed Nero had finally descended fully into madness, desperate to possess a version of his lost love that could not leave him, at least not without permission. He was dressed in imperial robes, adorned with jewels, and referred to as Pompeia. Nero was not just emperor. He was actor, musician. He believed in illusion, in spectacle, in power that bent the world to his will. Nero married him in a public ceremony, complete with dowry, veil, and all the rights of a Roman bride. Perhaps because of obedience, perhaps because his voice had been stolen along with his body, we do not know what Sporus thought. And yet the people watched. They watched as their emperor reshaped reality. If Nero could turn a boy into a wife, what else could he force the world to accept? What mattered was that she was gone, and Nero could not live without her. He had statues made in her image. He adorned temples with her likeness. He spoke to her at night, whispering in the shadows. That was when Nero saw him. A young slave boy, soft-featured, delicate, graceful in movement. His name. No one knows exactly what passed through Nero's mind the moment he laid eyes on the boy. And so began one of the most disturbing tales in Roman imperial history. Nero had Sporus. The boy, no older than 14, was stripped not only of his manhood, but of his future, his voice, and his agency. The court played along. Who would dare oppose the emperor's fantasy? But this was more than grief. It was more than perversion. It was the ultimate expression of control. Nero had rewritten reality itself. He had reversed death, not with magic, but with mutilation. He had turned a boy into a bride, and no one could stop him. To understand how this horror unfolded without resistance, one must first understand the empire. Nero ruled not with justice but with performance, and grief was his most tragic stage. Rome had always been a city of masks. Even at its most brutal, its most imperial, it thrived on theater, rituals, pageantry, the illusion of order. And Nero understood that better than anyone. He wasn't just an emperor. He was a performer, a man who lived on the edge of stage and throne. At banquets, Sporus was seated where Pompeo once reclined, served delicacies too rich to digest, and toasted by generals and poets who dared not flinch. He was more than a companion. He was a prop, a living monument to Nero's control over life, death, and perception. And when he placed Sporus beside him, adorned like a ghost bride reborn, he wasn't just grieving. Every room Nero entered was filled with people pretending not to see what was in front of them, a child mutilated and repurposed, seated beside a madman who called it love. He was scripting reality. The imperial court became a theater of shadows. But beneath the layers of gold and silk, something darker pulsed. Nero had turned the empire into an echo chamber. He forced senators and patricians to sit for hours watching him sing and cry and scream on stage, while Sporus sat in the front row, veiled and obedient, playing the perfect empress to Rome's most unhinged actor. His advisors no longer advised. His soldiers no longer questioned. His citizens no longer spoke his name without fear. The few who dare express concern vanished into exile or silence. Senators bit their tongues. Historians wrote in euphemisms. And all the while, Nero's artistic ambitions grew more grotesque. Coins were minted bearing his image as Apollo, the god of music and light, as if death, like truth, could be revised. Statues of him began to appear in temples, placed beside the old gods as if to say, "This is not a man, this is destiny." And while Nero sang arias to himself, the empire began to tremble beneath his feet, because in the end, no amount of gold, no act of cruelty, no boy in a bridal veil could hide the truth. And yet, within the gilded walls of Nero's world, the illusion persisted. Musicians still played, wine still flowed, and Sporus still stood by Nero's side, draped in silks, a quiet specter of a dead emperors reborn. He staged performances where he played tragic heroes, Orestes, Hercules, Niobe, figures consumed by grief or vengeance. But Nero's obsession with control wasn't limited to the theater. The people were tired of Nero's theatrics, tired of his taxes, tired of the cult of personality that demanded worship not of Rome, but of one man. Cracks had begun to form not just in the provinces, where governors grew restless, but within the city itself. He had begun to rewrite laws in accordance with his fantasies. Some said Sporus had grown pale and frail, that the constant role-play of femininity had worn his spirit thin. Others believed he had accepted his fate, embraced the role of empress, if only to survive. Senators once loyal began to speak in shadows. Military commanders questioned their allegiance. Even those who once cheered Nero's lyre began to tune their ears elsewhere. He began building a new city in his own image. He called it Grand Villa, temples to himself, a palace that glittered with gold. His Domus Aurea, his golden house, was an opulent fevered dream built on the ruins of those who could no longer afford to exist. And Sporus remained by his side, not as a person, not even as a symbol, but as proof Proof that Nero could conquer the laws of man and nature, that grief could be overcome not by acceptance but by reconstruction. But in the streets of Rome, unrest simmered. The people were growing uneasy. The treasury was depleted. The army was restless. Power was rewriting nature and history by sheer will. Rome was falling out of love with Nero. Outside the palace walls, Rome was burning. Not in the literal sense, though that would come, but in the slow, suffocating burn of decay. The people whispered. The Senate seethed. But illusions, even imperial ones, are fragile. The empire had grown tired. The fire would ignite soon enough, and when it did, Nero would do what he always had, perform. But before that flame, before the ashes, there was a whisper of treason. And what of Sporus? He remained silent, still a living reminder of Nero's descent into madness. But perhaps beneath the veil, he mourned for something greater than his manhood. Perhaps he mourned for the boy he used to be. Still, Nero clung to him. As the Senate grew colder, Nero leaned further into delusion, and Sporus was there for every banquet, every unveiling, every moment of twisted grandeur. He was there when Nero sang to a crowd of slaves dressed as gods. He was there when Nero forced dignitaries to listen to his poetry for hours. He was there when Nero declared himself not only ruler of Rome, but Rome itself. It was no longer about Pompeia. It was no longer about love or grief. It was about possession. Sporus had become the symbol of a new Rome, Nero's Rome, where identity, reality, and morality bent under the emperor's gaze. But the people were not blind. They watched and they remembered. And somewhere, just beyond the walls of the palace, soldiers began to march, not for Nero, but against him. It started with smoke. On a hot July night in 64 A.D., flames erupted in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus. Fueled by wooden structures, flammable oils, and narrow alleys, the fire spread with ferocity that defied belief. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burned. Marble cracked in the heat. Temples collapsed. Thousands fled. Thousands more perished. But for the tragedy of burning city that didn't yet reflect his vision, Nero ordered mass arrests, executions, tortures in the arena. And through it all, Sporus remained by his side, silent, almost spectral. He watched it from a tower, lyre in hand, as legend tells us, playing, singing, weeping not for the people. When the smoke cleared, 10 of Rome's 14 districts were reduced to ash. Publicly, Nero blamed the Christians, a strange, growing sect of outsiders whose customs made them easy scapegoats. The Domus Aurea, his golden palace, had always required sacrifice, and now, with Rome in ruins, he could rebuild it in his image. But behind closed doors, a different truth whispered through the rubble. And just as he had reshaped Sporus to fit his grief, he would now reshape the city to fit his madness. Some believe Nero had ordered the fire himself to clear space for his massive building projects. Rebirth through flame, creation through destruction. Nero envisioned a new Rome rising from ash like the phoenix, radiant, theatrical, utterly his. Performances, statues of himself in heroic poses, opulence in a time of ashes. But the cost was high. The people were not fools. They had lost homes, families, livelihoods. And the emperor responded with poems. The whispers of revolt became murmurs. Murmurs became rumors. And rumors became plans. The Senate began to stir. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, grew restless. He tried to distract. He hosted more games, more feasts. He offered coin to the poor, bread to the hungry. Even marriages between nobles and plebeians meant to demonstrate unity. But the damage was done. The legions in provinces Gaul, Hispania, Africa watched and waited. Nero sensed it, and still Sporus stood beside him. How much did the boy understand? He wept. He trembled. He paced the halls of a borrowed villa outside Rome, muttering to himself, not as an emperor, but as a man cornered by the truth he had long denied. Did he fear what would come? Or had he, like so many others in Nero's orbit, accepted that the world no longer made sense? A frightened voice echoing inside a broken palace. Sporus had become a metaphor, a mirror of an empire castrated, robbed of its dignity, its power, and its truth. Whether it was out of fear, loyalty, or the absence of any alternative, Sporus stayed, made to smile while bleeding. As rebellion took root, Nero clung tighter to illusion. He traveled with Sporus as if nothing were wrong. He sang songs of mourning and rebirth, of empires and gods, all while the walls crumbled around him. But even Nero, in his vanity, could not ignore what was coming. One by one, the provinces declared against him. He rehearsed his own death repeatedly, asking how to position the dagger, muttering, "Qualis artifex perio." Cornered and shaking, Nero begged one of his freedmen to assist. With trembling hands, he pressed the blade to his throat. One by one, his allies defected, and finally the Senate, once loyal, now desperate, declared him an enemy of the state. Nero fled. Others say he was silent, still a witness to the final act of a man who had remade his world in the shape of tragedy. The last days of Nero's reign were not marked by glory or grandeur, but by silence and shadows. When news reached him that the Senate had condemned him, and that the Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguard, had abandoned him, Nero did not rally troops or attempt escape to distant provinces. He was no god, no artist, no eternal flame, just a fugitive. And through all of it, Sporus was still there. He was a living remnant of Nero's reign, passed like a token between men of power, each one seeking to claim the strange myth of the boy. By this point, Nero had no allies left, only servants too afraid to flee, and Sporus, who remained by his side in this surreal performance of downfall. Historians do not describe his expressions. We do not know if he cried or prayed or simply endured, but the image is striking. The former emperor of Rome, barefoot, unshaven, whispering verses of poetry to himself, and beside him the boy he had mutilated, dressed still in a woman's robe, standing like a ghost made flesh. Nero tried to dig a grave. According to Suetonius, he instructed his servants to dig a pit in a garden, sobbing as he asked them to bury him with dignity. But when the moment came, he hesitated. It was not courage that led him to take his own life, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats, soldiers coming to arrest him, and the voice that broke the silence was the voice of his freedman Epaphroditus, urging him to act before capture. With shaking hands, Nero drove the blade into his throat. It was a messy, unceremonious end for the self-proclaimed god artist of Rome. As he lay dying, he is said to have murmured, "Qualis artifex perio," "What an artist dies in me." Moments later, the soldiers arrived. They found only the still body of the emperor, blood pooling on the floor, and Sporus standing nearby, silent as ever. What happened to Sporus after Nero's death was no less tragic. He was claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian Guard's new prefect, who treated him as a prize, parading him before his troops as a symbol of the fallen emperor. But Sabinus's reign was brief, and soon Sporus was passed into the hands of Otho, a former friend of Nero and briefly emperor himself. It seemed Sporus was doomed to orbit power, never escaping the role Nero had cast for him. Otho treated him with a strange reverence, perhaps seeing in him a connection to the decadent court they had once shared. But when Otho's rule ended in suicide after only 3 months, Sporus was once again left adrift in the dangerous currents of Roman politics. Then came Vitellius. Crude, indulgent, and with little interest in subtlety, Vitellius saw Sporus not as a person, but as an object of mockery and entertainment. According to some accounts, he planned to force Sporus to take part in a public spectacle, a reenactment of the rape of Persephone, in which Sporus would be symbolically violated before the Roman crowd. For Sporus, this was a breaking point. Having endured years of control, humiliation, and the erasure of his own identity, he chose his final act. Rather than submit to yet another grotesque performance, Sporus took his own life. The details are scarce, but historians agree. He preferred death to the final humiliation Vitellius intended, and so ended the life of the boy who had once been turned into an empress, not with the dignity he deserved, but with the quiet agency of refusing to be a prop any longer. His story, pieced together from fragments, is as much a tale of power as it is of loss, of how grief can warp into domination, how love can be twisted into possession, and how an empire can stand by in silence while cruelty parades a spectacle. The Rome that had allowed this was the same Rome that cheered in the arena as men were torn apart by beasts, that crucified rebels along its roads, that reveled in theater both literal and political. But Sporus' story lingers because it is not just about Rome's appetite for spectacle. It is about the human cost hidden behind marble columns and golden curtains. In the end, the boy who was renamed, reshaped, and erased outlived a man who tried to make him immortal. He survived Nero. He survived the chaos that followed. But he could not survive Rome's hunger for performance. Centuries later, his name still echoes in the darker chapters of imperial history, a reminder how absolute power not only corrupts absolutely, it consumes. Sporus was neither hero nor villain. He was a victim who became a symbol, and symbols in Rome rarely got to write their own endings. His silence in life has left us with questions we can never answer. Did he ever dream of escape? Did he ever hate Nero? Or did he, in some small, tragic way, believe in the role he was forced to play? The marble ruins of the Domus Aurea still stand in fragments today, their faded frescoes a shadow of the world Nero built. Tourists walk at halls unaware that somewhere within these walls, history's most twisted marriage played out, a union not of love, but of grief, vanity, and control. And though the emperor is remembered for his excesses, his cruelty, and his downfall, the story of Sporus remains one of the most haunting footnotes of Rome's imperial age. Perhaps the cruelest truth is this. In making Sporus into a living memorial, Nero ensured that his own madness would be remembered alongside the boy's name. They are bound together in history, emperor and empress, captor and captive, actor and unwilling co-star, their final curtain call written not by the playwrights of Rome, but by time itself. The empire would march on, new emperors would rise and fall, and the city would rebuild itself over and over again. But somewhere in the dust of the centuries, the veil still rests on an empty head, and the echoes of a stolen voice still linger in the marble silence.